In our last session we took up the whole question of violence, and we said that religion has functioned as a force to legitimise violence. It legitimised violence in the Old Testament. It was the religion of the Jews that legitimised the destruction of enemy people opposed to Israel. It was religion that legitimised the hope of Jewish apocalyptic, namely the utter overthrow, the violent overthrow and the destruction of all the powers that were arrayed against Israel. That was the great hope of Jewish apocalyptic, that their violence against Israel would be met by divine violence, and they hoped for the coming of the kingdom to bring this into effect. Their view of the kingdom of God was like a super state practicing a form of super violence. And the Jews legitimised the violent execution of Jesus by their religion. I believe that if we lived in that time and we tried like them conscientiously and religiously to carry out the Old Testament to the letter, we too would have demanded the execution of Jesus, because they had strong religious background according to the law to do that. We don't need to go into that detail now. The justice demanded in the law of Moses was a violent kind of justice. You can't escape the fact. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It sanctions or it sacralises violence. And this was all brought to a head in the execution of Jesus. Now we take up the Christian religion. One writer has well said that Christianity, this is a Christian scholar himself, well known in this country, I believe a Harvard scholar. Christianity, says John Hick, has generated savage wars of religion and supported innumerable just wars, has tortured and burned multitudes of heretics and witches in the name of God, and has motivated and authorised the persecution of the Jews. And a well-known woman author, Rosemary Ruther, says, it probably would not be difficult to prove that more violence, chauvinism and hostility between groups have been fomented by Christianity than most other religions. The Roman Catholic scholar Hans Kung has pointed out that Christianity as a religion has produced more or made more martyrs of other people than it has produced from its own ranks. Now when we look at this violence, the violence of the history of the Christian religion, and see how it too has been responsible for the shedding of so much blood, we must not see this as something that is an aberration of Christianity, as if this was just like a few barnacles on the ship. It is something which has appeared consistently throughout the history of the Christian religion and Christian culture. I want to suggest the terrible thought that Christianity at its very heart also legitimizes violence. In fact, violence is indeed at the heart of the Orthodox Christian religion. Violence, it's there at its very heart. It has a theory of divine violence. Now the Jews looked upon the execution of Jesus Christ as an exhibition of divine violence, which they said was legitimate. It's called, we're carrying out the law. It's according to our religion. We have a law, they said, and by our law he ought to die. This is to the Jew, the death of this Jesus, this phony Messiah, as he appeared to them. This phony Messiah was experiencing nothing else but a demonstration of divine violence they were carrying out on God's behalf. They were doing this for God, you remember. They were carrying out on God's behalf and practicing divine violence in his execution. And it was a very bloody, gruesome execution. So they say this death of Jesus is an exhibition of divine violence. Now, instead of us Christians coming along and saying it's nothing to do with an exhibition of divine violence at all, we carry it on further and we say, indeed it is. It's an exhibition of divine violence more horrible than you Jews have ever dreamt of. That's namely because this God of justice has books, and according to the principle of a justice, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, all wrongs have to be righted, all debts have to be paid, the balance of the books have to be balanced. God can't forgive unless he satisfies, and that's a term in theology, the satisfication. God must first satisfy the sentiment of judicial or a judicial sentiment. And only then, of course, can forgiveness be offered to those for whom Christ has died. This is a justification. This legitimizes at its very heart, because this is the starting point of all Christian theology, of Orthodox Christianity. A great, well-known apologist for Orthodox Christianity. In fact, he wrote a book on Orthodox Christianity. Here from Fuller Seminary, he's Carnell, Edward Carnell, points to this reality, this atonement concept, and says this is Christianity. And then the corollary, that is the inevitable, the other face to this view of a blood debt atonement. Sin has to be punished. Sin has to be paid for. The debt must be expiated. Before God can be the forgiving God that he wants to be. The reverse side of that, or the other side of that, and it belongs to it, is the Orthodox Christian doctrine of hell. Now, if we want any demonstration that God is, this God of the Christian religion is a God of violence, let's confront the reality of the doctrine of hell. Here, God is supposed to practice a form of violence that is so horrific and unimaginable that people have known to faint just in contemplation of it. And others have gone, there are throughout the history of the world, there are cases, documented cases, that it has so bugged people, it is so horrific that human beings have clear gone off their brains, have lost their reason. But those two things, of course, are only looking at the one event, because, as we say in theology, inaugurated eschatology, which is the first advent of Christ, consummated eschatology, the second advent of Christ, are only two stages in the one event. So if you believe in the divine violence of Calvary, what was going on was not that the Jews, not only the Jews were practicing violence, religious violence, but God himself was even outdoing what they were doing. Now, if you believe that, at Calvary what was taking place was a form of divine violence, the eye for an eye and a tooth justice, as if to say, here is human wrong, here is human violence. How does God react against human violence? And how does he overcome human violence? Well, the doctrine of the atonement, the blood atonement, the Orthodox doctrine virtually says, God overcomes violence with violence. Now, if you believe that on the death of Christ, you must move to the other view, the second coming, with this horrific hell. Now, I don't care if you have a modified Adventist or Jehovah's Witness form of hell either. That's a sort of a more humane hell. That some people, you know, they suffer according to how hard they are. It's like, I'm a farmer by sort of background, and when we clear land and we burn old stumps and branches and so on, and you make a big fire and the branches burn up very quickly, and the old stumps go on and they burn on and on and on and on for days, you know. Some people say, well, it's like that. The branches burn up pretty quickly. But hardened old sinners like RDB, you know, he's going to burn a long time. See? Now, all that stuff, you know, you've got this doctrine of divine violence, of Jesus sort of propitiating the divine violence, absorbing it all on your behalf so that you can escape the divine violence that's coming at the second advent. But in the meantime, you see, you know, sings the evangelistic choir, Jesus is tenderly calling today. Calling today. Jesus is tenderly calling today. But, you know, if you don't accept this calling today, he'll come and a sword comes out of his mouth and there's going to be blood up to the horses' bridles, it says in some place in Scripture. And there's going to be, you know, a tremendous, he's coming in vengeance, he's coming in flaming fire to take vengeance on those who don't, you know, respond to the tenderly calling today. And it's hard. You can't escape the fact it's a religion of violence. And I could go on quoting you, that this has been appealed to again and again. The blood of Calvary and the idea of hell has been appealed again and again to justify all sorts of wars, all sorts of bloodshed, all sorts of violence down through the history of Christianity. Even by the men who ran the Inquisition, don't think they were just evil men. They were carrying out a sacred task, very unpleasant to them. And some of those men, what they had to do in the persecution of heretics was something that was very hard for them to do. I know there may have been sadomasochists involved in that, but don't think it was in the case of some. They felt that they had to do what they could do because if these people didn't repent, unless the heretics come out of their heresy, they were going to fall into the hands of a living God, and it was going to be terrible beyond imagination. So the mere torture over a few days was nothing to what was going to happen to them if they fell into the hands of God. So there were the men who ran the Inquisition in this religious context were humanitarians. And I have to say that's serious. They were Sunday picnickers compared with this God of divine violence. And so throughout the history of Christianity, we have this constant legitimizing of violence. And I believe in that we come to the very heart of it. I'll read a few authors. Christianity, though providing in recent centuries a birthplace for modern science and a home of modern liberal ideas of equality and freedom, has generated savage wars of religion, tortured and burned multitudes of heretics. We've read some of that. Has tolerated the systematic racism, the Western capitalist rape of the earth, the misuse of nuclear energy, Christian absolutism in collaboration with acquisitive and violent human nature has done much to poison the relationship between the Christian minority and the non-Christian majority of the world's population by sanctifying exploitation and the oppression on a gigantic scale. Many more we could go on, and examples of it, of American Christianity, of the Christianity in the old world. And the gospel played a vital role in the self-justification of Western imperialism. Well, I'm not going to go in to read the documentation of that. Some of it, we'll print some more of some of those historical documentation. Even if we look at the history of America, this nation was founded by the Pilgrim Fathers. Very moral, very ethical. very Protestant. And the Pilgrim Fathers saw themselves as reenacting the story of the Exodus. Now that is a very important thing that entered into American mythology. It's influenced the whole culture of America. These founders of this nation saw themselves as reenacting the Exodus. They were fleeing from Egypt, the old world, Europe, the land of persecution. They were coming here to a new land, a new promised land, the land of Canaan. They miraculously crossed the Atlantic, and all the miracles of being saved from the sea was to them evidences of a divine providence, just as much as Israel and all the miracles of crossing the Red Sea too. When they landed in this country, first of all, they were faced with a great wilderness before them. And they had to conquer this wilderness. Just like the children of Israel passed through the wilderness, so they had to conquer this wilderness. And just as the children of Israel encountered indigenous people who inhabited the land, and they had to be driven off, so these holy people encountered the Indians that had to be driven out to make way for the righteous people who had a divine mandate, you see, to do what they're doing. And as for the Catholics, who presumed to leave Europe and get on the new promised land, they weren't to be tolerated here, nor the Quakers with their queer heretical religion. And as for the witches, you know what they did with them. And over in Massachusetts, they began to kill the Quakers, and they began to kill the witches. And it was violence that was religiously legitimized. They thought it was a sacred duty. They were driven to do it. Then you have the whole ferment of, they saw as because of what happened in this country, because the pluralism, the religious pluralism, this wasn't going to work. And out of this history moved them to recognize, in order to be any sane solution of the problem, there had to be the separation of religion, the separation of church and state. But the mentality, the religious consciousness, has never left the nation, even though we've seen a great process of secularism and so on overtake the country. A lot of very interesting books have been written about the Redeemer mentality of America. America was a religiously founded, and even though a great mass of people may not be hooked vitally into the church, this idea of the Redeemer nation has settled down into what some authors have called a sort of popular civil religion. That this Redeemer nation must become the sort of the moral policeman of the world, that it is ordained, it has a sort of divine providence and a divine destiny to fulfill. And this type of consciousness has had a tremendous effect on the relationship to the rest of the world. It is the bulwark, of course, to resist the forces of darkness and evil communism. Now, if you read the literature, and I can only touch on this, on the battle of the Cold War and so on, you'll find that the philosophy behind that is fundamentally religious, and the conflict takes on the connotation not just of an ordinary conflict. The conflict takes on the connotation of a holy war, which has deeply influenced, of course, the political philosophy, the foreign policy, and I don't want to go on. I mean, I want to be welcomed back to this country, so I don't want to say too much more, but I could go on to the, activity in fomenting violence and fomenting rebellion and foreign relationships and so on. But I think if you read the newspapers, you can read some of the things, the astonishing things that are going on. Violence has been again and again legitimized, right up including the whole outlook toward the armament race and the bomb itself. And you only have to look around this country to see where the strongest basis for and the strongest agitation for that military stance and building up a greater military arsenal comes from the religious right. The greatest hawks in this country. And we leave this scene. We look out in the world today and look at the great trouble spots of the world and the violence there, the explosive situation that we now face in our world today, all the great trouble spots associated with religiously legitimised, religiously inspired violence. Palestine, Lebanon, Iran, Fiji, Ireland. Yes, Ireland. Religiously legitimised violence. They're in a holy war, you see. They're locked into a holy war. That's the problem. I remember seeing a cartoon of these big Irishmen sitting in an Irish pub drinking, and there's one fella just sitting, sitting apart from some of these big tough-looking thugs, and one fella turns to this fella by himself and he says, "Oh, Shanigan," he says, "how come," he says, "you're not involved in this looting and shooting and burning and are you an atheist or something?" All over this world today. One very insightful commentator says, unless this issue today of religiously inspired violence, unless it can be diffused, it may very well lead to the destruction of this whole world before we even see the 21st century. Now, into this picture, I want again, we throw the story, the drama of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And I suggest to you, this is a story that can be understood by all people everywhere, irrespective of what their culture or religious background is. And don't think because you're a Christian you've got a handle on the story before anything else, because I want to suggest that we Christians have so botched up this story that we're the least ones to understand it. And I think a man like Gandhi understood more about what the story means than we Christians. Because the Palestine of 2,000 years ago wasn't much different from modern-day Palestine. That's a remarkable thing, isn't it? It was a mass of seething, religiously inspired violence on every hand in those days, just ready to explode, and all demanding their justice and the spirit of revenge, fueled by religion. And into this scene steps this life of this man proclaiming a new kind of justice. Resist not evil. Pray for them that despitefully use you and for those that persecute you. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say dispense with that method of justice and love your enemies and those who do evil against you. And he said, if you do all this, you'll be like your Father in heaven, who sends his rain upon the just and the unjust. Now, I want to tell you, if he said, practice like that and be like your Father in heaven, does then the Father in heaven, does he use violence, more violence against violence? Does he carry on the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Is his justice the payback kind of justice of the old atonement idea of the Old Testament? Or is the New Testament not like the Old Testament? I say the new is unlike the old. Not like the old. That's the book of Hebrews. It says the old type is not like the new. The new is altogether different. It turns the old on its head. Now, this life, in all this religiously inspired violence, it turns on him, it makes battle against him, And the story of the resurrection is that life that he was dedicated to, that life that now we are convinced that God is uniquely identified with. That life triumphed over all that violence and rose above it and proclaimed that it was vanquished, that it was defeated, that you no need to follow it and give your allegiance to it. So that now all our holy wars and all our isms, the things we fight for, capitalism, communism, socialism, democracy, monarchy, people involved in those isms, they make holy wars out of those issues. God is not to be confused with capitalism. Do you know God's not a capitalist? Do you know he's not a socialist? Of course he's not. The God in gospel is not going to be identified with those humanisms. He's separate from all those things as much as he's separate from the creation that he has made. You have to desacralize all those things. Now, I'm not saying you can't be a Democrat. That's all right, as long as you don't sacralize the thing. Make a holy war out of being a Democrat or a Republican or whatever you're involved in. Take all that out of it. In the name of the gospel, take all that out of it. And when you desacralize, all your isms and all your ideology is now desacralized. You desacralize all the holy wars, and you get to the issue, you get to the bottom of everything. When you remove all these artificial distinctions that these things are common and these things are sacred, and all that's gone in the light of the resurrection of Christ, and all things are desacralized, and all the isms and all your ideologies are now desacralized, you have no excuse at all to participate in these things as if it's a holy war. Then you get to the root of everything, which is the desacralization of violence itself. Thank you.